About a minute. All right, let's get started. All right, let's do this. Los Amoradores. In the early years of the 16th century, Pedro Real and Pedro del Plata were two drab ports in the north shore of Hispaniola. Everything seemed modest and temporary. A couple of muddy streets, thatched huts with one or two stone houses, half-built churches that lacked even stone crosses. These communities were dangerously exposed to the tropical storms and hurricanes that sometimes roared through the Caribbean basin. Yet, as the indigenous people of Hispaniola became scarce, Pedro Real and Pedro del Plata came alive. Local residents and wealthy colonialists pooled their resources, chartered or brought on dilapidated boats, hired Dish Eveld. I have to look up this word, everybody. Hold on a second. It's disheveled. Oh my God. Someone tell me what page we're on. It did the whole thing. I don't know why. Jesus Christ. The thing jumped on me. So I don't know what page we're on anymore. God damn it. Stop. Jesus Christ. Why did it do that? Why did it just jump on me? Jumped all the way to like the 200 and something. All right, let's start all over. Here we go again. We're going to try this again. Since I lost everything. Sorry, everybody. In earlier years of the 16th century, Pedro Real and Pedro del Plata were two drab ports on the north shore of Hispaniola. Everything seemed modest and temporary. A couple of muddy streets, thatched huts with one or two stone houses, half-built churches that lacked even stone crosses. These communities were dangerously exposed to tropical storms and hurricanes and sometimes roared through the Caribbean basin. Yet, as the indigenous peoples of Hispaniola became scarce, Pedro Real and Pedro del Plata came alive. Local residents and wealthy colonialists pooled their resources, chartered and brought dilapidated boats, hired disheveled crews, and launched their merchant vessels across the Caribbean Sea. They were known as Los Amadores, shipowners, an appellation that seems much too grand when compared with their counterparts of Seville, who were at the same time launching armadas across the Atlantic and around the world. The north shore of Hispaniola opened up to the green-blue waters of the Caribbean and to dozens of islands that were large enough to sustain native populations, but small enough that the people could not hide from Spanish slavers. Even the Caribbean geography seemed ideal for the trafficking of indigenous peoples. Directly to the east were the Lesser Antilles, a cluster of islands in the shape of an arc, inhabited by Caribbean indigenous peoples, and reaching all the way to South America. The Caribbees refused to submit to the Spaniards or even negotiate. Spaniards regarded them as fierce, physically strong and very dangerous because they used arrowheads dipped in poison, substance made from shrubs and plants. Other observers noted that, quote, those who are wounded with this poison die in wreathing pain, throwing up, biting their own hands, and besides themselves an account of a great pain. But the practice of the Caribs that stood out most in the collective European minds was cannibalism. Columbus was the first to make oh my gosh, I gotta look up this word again. Hold on, everybody. Okay, invidious. Sorry, everybody. Invidious distinctions between the friendly indigenous peoples of the large islands and the cannibals of the Lesser Antilles. And indeed, we won the terms. Indeed, we owe the term cannibal to the admiral's conflation of the term cannaba on appellations for the fierce peoples of the Eastern Caribbean, with their customs of eating human flesh. Eventually, the term was applied to all men-eating peoples. North of Hispaniola lay the Bahamas. The Spaniards called them Las Coyas, but also knew them as Las Antilles Antilles, the useless islands, because they did not possess gold, pearls, or any other marketable products. The only goods that could be derived from them were indigenous peoples. Opinions varied about the nature of the Lacayo indigenous peoples, their degree of civilization, and whether or not they were cannibals. But there was a broad consensus among the Spaniards of Hispaniola that the Lacayos had to be removed from a place where there was nothing of value and transported to other islands where their work was badly needed. Since the life of these natives were oriented towards the sea, many of them ended their days in the pearl fisheries, quote, the most infernal and wild life of our time, according to a knowledgeable 16th century witness. Beyond the Lesser Antilles and the Bahamas, Spanish miners caught glimpses of coastal Florida and the shores of Central America, Colombia, and Venezuela. This was the edge of their known world. Some of these lands were thought to be inhabited by giants. Indeed, the islands of Aruba, Curaçao, and Bonaire, who off the coast of Venezuela, were called Las Islas de las Gigantes. The belief in these giants arose partly from the chivalric romances that were popular among the conquistadors, but also from the very real fact that natives in some of these areas were considerably taller than 16th century Spaniards. Whether they were real giants or merely tall, these indigenous peoples were highly prized by Europeans. The first step for anyone wishing to launch a slaving expedition was to obtain a license. Clandestine slaving wasn't possible, but because captives needed to be certified by crown officials before their legal sale in the market of Hispaniola or Puerto Rico, it was best to get a license. Although King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella had prohibited the enslavement of indigenous peoples in 1500, their order was followed by what appeared to them to be three judicious exceptions. In 1503, the crown authorized the enslavement of indigenous people who were cannibals. Cannibalism being an especially nefarious practice that marked those who engaged in this practice as somehow less than human. In 1504, the monarch was also allowed the captures of indigenous people, taking in, quote, just wars, extending to the New World the doctrine that had long justified the impressment and bondage of enemies in Europe. And in 1506, the monarchs permitted the colonialists to, quote, ransom indigenous peoples who were enslaved by other indigenous peoples and whom the Spaniards could then keep as slaves. The logic being that ransomed indigenous peoples would at least become Christianized and their souls would be saved. Governor Ovando and his successors were able to issue license by taking advantage of these expeditions. One of the three, they most often used cannibalism as legitimize their raids. Scholars have argued that earlier Spaniards had perverse incentives to exaggerate, sensationalize, and even fabricate stories of man-eating indigenous peoples. Given the legal context, contemporaries also recognize as much. A Spanish judge included in 1518 that many armadores were, quote, taking indigenous people from Barbados, the Gigantes, and elsewhere, who are not Caribs, nor proper to be slaves, end quote. But as with the Cunards, there are a kernel of truth in this one. Cannibalism was real in some quarters of the Caribbean and elsewhere in the New World. Slave traffickers prowled the Caribbeans in the 1510s and 1520s, greatly expanding Europeans' geographic knowledge. Juan Ponce de Leon, the discoverer of Florida, often depicted as a deluded explorer bent on finding the fountain of youth, as was in fact deeply involved in the early Caribbean slave trade, sponsoring slave voyages to the Bahamas and opening Florida to the trade. In fact, the royal patent confirmed Ponce de Leon's discovery of the island, quote unquote, of Florida, allowing him to wage war and seize disobedient indigenous peoples and carry them away for slaves, end quote. Similarly, the Spaniards who first laid claim to the coast of South Carolina, Lucas Vasquez de Leon, a man of, quote, great learning and gravity, end quote, deferential address as El Licenciado, was a prime mover in the slave trade. The term licendio refers to someone who holds a university degree, usually a lawyer. We often think of these men simply as, quote, discoverers, when in reality considerable overlap exists between discoverers and slavers. Somewhat counterintuitively, the dispersion of native peoples across the Caribbean greatly facilitated the task of capturing and transporting them. Villagers living in small communities on self-contained and exposed islands had little chance to hide from the intruders or to repel unexpected attacks. Slave raiders formed compact groups of around 50 to 60 men. They arrived quietly on their ships, waiting until nighttime, quote, when the indigenous peoples were secure in their mats, end quote, and descended on the natives peoples, setting their thatched huts on fire, killing anyone who resisted, and captured all others, irrespective of age or gender. Once the initial ambush was over, the slavers often had pursue the indigenous peoples who had escaped, unleashing their mastiffs or running the natives down with their horses. If there were many captives, the slavers took the trouble of building temporary holding pens by the beach close to where the ships were moored, while horsemen combed the island. The attackers literally carried off entire populations, leaving empty islands in their wake. The indigenous peoples were then loaded on the ship, packed into a space below decks. The scene in the hold of the slaving ships was infernal. Lack of air, poor provisioning, and relentless tropical heat magnified the slaves' suffering to the highest degree. Quote, the indigenous people could not move, end quote, wrote a young man from Milan named Girolamo Bonzeno, and they were laying like animals amid their vomits and feces. When the seas was calm and the ship could not move, sometimes there was no water for those poor people, broke down by their heat and bad smell and the discomfort. They died miserably down there. Unlike the Middle Passage, which required a month of travel, slaving voyages in the Caribbean lasted only a few days. Yet the mortality rates of these short passages surpassed those of the transatlantic voyages. Fer Las Casa reported that, quote, it was never the case that the ship carried 300 or 400 people, did not have to throw overboard 100 or 150 bodies out of lack of food and water, end quote, making for the mortality rate of 25 to 50%. Although it is attempting to disregard the claims of another of Las Casas, exaggeration, sources confirm his mortality estimates. Vasquez del Ayllon's slaving expeditions were among the most notorious for their poor provisioning and very high mortality rates, which cut deeply into his profits and caused untold human suffering and senseless death. Spanish slavers did not win every time. In particular, the native people of the Lesser Antilles were able to fend off raids and occasionally even go on the offensive. Surprisingly, lonely ships and Spanish strongholds. In 1513, about 1,000 Caribs attacked the Spanish settlements of Puerto Rico, killed many colonialists. Ponce de Leon blundered when he led the retaliators' slaving raids on the island of Guadalupe in 1515, which ended the total disaster. 20 Spaniards were wounded and 5 died. The indigenous peoples found themselves at a tremendous technological disadvantage. Indigenous arrowheads made of fishbone could not penetrate the chain-mail armor of the Spaniards. The indigenous canoes, though they were easily outmaneuvered, a caravel had no chance in a long-distance chase. Nevertheless, the natives were occasionally able to prevail against the Europeans. In general, however, small crews of European slavers operated from dilapidated ships proved tremendously effective in subduing the capturing indigenous peoples across the Caribbean. Slaving licenses issued by Crown authorities revealed just how responsive these crews were to market opportunities. The number of licenses grew steadily from 1514 through 1517, the years when the Taínos of Hispaniola were no longer available in sufficient numbers to satisfy the Spaniards' demand for gold. There was a sudden drop in license in 1518, followed by an extraordinary spike in 1519. It is not difficult to explain these changes. A smallpox epidemic ravaged the Caribbean archipelago in 1518, curtailing the traffickers' activities. The following year, slavers worked harder than ever before to replenish the dead or dying indigenous workforce of the large Caribbean islands, launching more slaving raids than in all the previous years combined, and spreading desolation and death to the Bahamas and the Lesser Antilles, a part of the mainland. We can only imagine the grim circumstances of the Caribbean islanders who had to endure the alarming epidemic that took the lives of family members and neighbors, causing widespread dislocation and famine and tremendous hardships. And just when the worst seemed to be subsiding, indigenous slavers appeared on the horizon, ready to stuff them into the holds of their ship and take them to the gold fields of Espanola or the pearl banks off the coast of Venezuela. The Bahamas became almost entirely depopulated. Las Casas estimated a number of Lacoyas captured at 40,000, while the slave traffickers put the figure at only 15,000. Regardless of the actual number, no Lacayo communities remained in the Bahamas except as bands of refugees. By 1520, the Almoravides, like Vasquez de Eloin, were forced to bypass the Bahamian archipelago, although they venture onto Florida and beyond to find human prey. The shorthand version of the history of the Americas posits the virgin soil epidemics were at the root of the demographic devastation that ensued. However, an exclusively biological explanation is at odds with much of the documentation of that era. It runs contrary to the observed adaptability of humans. In the long sweep of history, human populations have survived virgin soil epidemics. The most well-known case was the Black Death, possibly originating in China and spreading along the Silk Road. This epidemic arrived in Europe during the second half of the 14th century, when devastating outbreaks wiped out perhaps 1/3 of the continent's inhabitants. It is hard to overstate the fear, suffering, and the dislocation caused by the Black Death, but its aftermath shows a resilience of human population. Europe's losses lingered until the early decades of the 15th century. But when the population made a stunning demographic comeback, men and women kept marrying, enjoying high standards of living, and had more children, boosting birth rates all across the continent. The recovery was powerful and long-lasting. By the middle of the 16th century, all major European regions had reached or surpassed the pre-plague population. Indeed, we can think of European colonization of the New World as an extension of this remarkable demographic rebound. Left to their own devices, the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean would have limited their exposure to illness, coping like many other human populations before and after them. We will never know how many indigenous people actually died of disease alone. But even if 1/3 or 2/3 of the Caribbean islanders had died of influenza, typhus, malaria, smallpox, they would have been able to stem the decline and, in the fullness of time, rebound demographically. In fact, some indigenous populations of the New World did just that. But unlike 14th century Europeans, the natives peoples of the Caribbean were not left to their own devices. In the wake of the epidemic, slavers appeared on the horizon. Good Intentions, Chapter 2. Hello, hello. Yeah. Just looking. All right. The Spanish monarchy. Oh, yeah. Good Intentions, Chapter 2. The Spanish monarchy may have been bureaucratic, torturous, and frequently implicit in the enslavement of indigenous peoples, but it was also capable of embracing a good cause. Well, let's see what they mean. In the wake of the demographic debacle of the Caribbean, a group of activists gathered around the Spanish court to stem the tide of further disaster in the earlier 1540s. The most visible figure among them was Friar Bartholomew de las Casas. One of his favorite tactics consisted of scandalizing court members by reading out loud from the manuscript that he would go on to publish a decade later under the title Brevissimo Relato de la Destructico de las Indigenous. They used a short account of the devastation of the Indies. University students today still learn about the gory details of Spain's conquest from this book. With the kings backed, these activists introduced a sweeping new legal code for the Americas intended to improve the lives of indigenous peoples. Erroneously known as the New Laws, this legislation attempt to achieve nothing less than a new beginning of a new compact with the native peoples of the New World. The New Laws of 1542 prohibited the granting of new economies, forbade colonialists to compel natives to carry loads against their will, and prevented Spaniards from forcing indigenous peoples to die for pearls. They were also quite explicit about indigenous slavery. Indigenous peoples were free vessels, quote unquote. The code affirmed, quote, so from here on, no indigenous people can be made into a slave under any circumstances, including war, rebellions, or when ransomed from other indigenous peoples. Spaniards who had long relied on indigenous laborers were in stock, and even later commentators were somewhat confused about the extent of this legislation. Yet there was no ambiguity in the laws themselves, loopholes in laws themselves, which absolutely prohibited any further enslavement of indigenous people, close to a few loopholes in previous legislations that had led to the Caribbean disaster. One might assume that, though well-meaning, the new laws were utterly unenforceable. Historians have long noted that they did not stop the enslavement of indigenous peoples, and this is undoubtedly true. Centuries after 1542, Spaniards continued to hold natives in bondage. But even though the laws failed in this regard, they did shape the contours of this institution to be remarkable extent. Owners found themselves perennially at risk of losing their indigenous slaves. Important colonial officials and complicit in the traffic of natives had to worry about royal investigations, and the indigenous peoples themselves learned that they were free vessels of the Spanish king. In fact, there is no better evidence for the enduring importance of the new laws than this lawsuit initiated by indigenous peoples all over the empire in an attempt to claim their freedom. If the laws did not matter, why bother? Clearly, the native people cared enough to take their masters to court, even at tremendous personal costs. A brief comparison with the illegal framework of slavery in the United States will reinforce this point. In the antebellum South, black slaves possessed no legal standings. They were barred from southern courtrooms, which were populated by white judges, lawyers, and witnesses, the majority of whom were slaveholders. Law superficially prevented persons of color, rather free or slave, to testify except in the rarest cases. Ironically, slaves were frequently the object of litigation. For example, buyers sued sellers over slaves, physical or moral defects, or sought compensation for slaves injured by overseers. Yet the slaves themselves could not act legally. A white master could mistreat or even kill a slave as long as there were no white witnesses. He could not be brought to justice, as the former slave Harriet Jacob famously wrote in her autobiographical account of slave women, has, quote, no shadow of law to protect her from insult, from violence, or even death, end quote. The notion that a slave could sue his or her master to attain freedom would be laughable to most Southerners during the first half of the 19th century. Spain's slaves lived under an entirely different legal regime. The new laws not only affirmed that indigenous peoples were free vessels, but also instructed the audiencia, or high courts, of the New World to, quote, put special care in the good treatment and conservation of the indigenous peoples, to remain informed of any abuses committed against indigenous peoples, and, quote, to act quickly and without delay, maliciously, as has happened in the past, end quote, because the Spanish legal system was open to indigenous peoples, a class of specialized lawyers that became known as procuradores generales de indigenis, served to represent them. This procuradors assisted indigenous clients in building their cases and navigating the Spanish bureaucracy. The stark contrast to black slaves in the antebellum South, indigenous peoples could rely on these lawyers for at least some representation in the Spanish legal system. To be sure, sedentary indigenous peoples living in large cities had a great deal more access to the law than nomadic peoples from the peripheral areas. And even those who lived in cities could not always rely on the letter of the law. Daily interactions between slaves, masters, and judges generated legal cultures that could deviate substantially from the strict interpretation of the law. Indigenous people may have been free vessels, quote unquote, in the eyes of the law, but Spanish masters resorted to slight changes in terminology, gray areas, and subtle reinterpretations to continue to hold indigenous peoples in bondage. Still, the larger point remains true. The legal regimes under which African and indigenous slaves operated were vastly different. The title of this book, The Other Slavery, is meant to draw the contrast between African and indigenous slaves that is ultimately rooted in the law. Indigenous peoples of Spain. Here we go. Hey, Wilby. Hey, everybody. All right. To understand how the law shaped the lives of indigenous slaves, we need to begin in Spain. During the first half of the 16th century, upwards of 2,500 natives were shipped to the Iberian Peninsula and spent years there toiling in obscurity. Locked up in the houses and shops in various towns and cities in southern and western Spain, they would have died without leaving a trace had it not been for the new laws of 1542, which specifically required all Spaniards already in possession of indigenous peoples to show their legitimate titles of ownership, and if they did not have them, to liberate their slaves at once. By all accounts, the Spanish King Charles I was very serious about enforcing this provision. Immediately after the promulgation of the code, he directed royal officials to make inquiries and look for native peoples held in bondage improperly. The man most directly responsible for carrying out this effort was Lacencio Jorragiro Lopez. He had been part of the small cabal that in 1541 and 1542 had pushed for the pro-indigenous legislation and in 1943 was appointed to Spain's powerful Council of the Indies. His first year of counselor was a veritable baptism of fire. He spent his time compiling the list of owners of indigenous slaves in Seville, gathering information about these native peoples and initiating no less than 16 lawsuits. He had to deal with irate slaveholders and decided the fates not only of native peoples who won their cases, but also, more dramatically, of those who lost. Lopez could not have been more different than Las Casa in temperament and method. The licenciado had never set foot in the New World. He was married to a cousin of Francisco Pizarro, a conqueror of Peru. He was a legal scholar who felt more comfortable poring over the minutiae of legal cases and making grand pronouncements in public. Yet Lopez, in his own quiet way, became the best hope for the enslaved indigenous peoples of Spain. The archives of Seville contain more than 100 cases of indigenous peoples who had the courage to partner with Spanish attorneys and officials to sue their masters. These cases were 16th century courtroom dramas, featured no faceless indigenous slaves, as I have called them thus far, but highly motivated humans began, such as Gaspar, Maria, and Bartres. Those stories are presented later in this chapter, pitted against owners who were just as motivated to hold on to what they regarded as their property. No indigenous slaves wrote detailed accounts of their lives comparable to the works penned by Africans and African American slaves, such as the Ola da Aquino Interesting Narrative, 1789, Frederick Douglass Narrative, 1845, and Harriet Jacobs Incident in the Life of a Slave Girl, 1861. Nonetheless, these court cases were powerful examples of how natives, even after they had been forcibly moved halfway around the world, were capable of adapting, making a place for themselves, and fighting to regain their freedom. Who were these indigenous peoples? They hailed from the areas colonized by Spain, first Hispaniola and other Caribbean islands, when coastal Mexico, Florida, and Venezuela, as well as elsewhere. The most striking observation about them is that the majority were women and children. When we think of the Middle Passage, we immediately imagine adult African males. This image is based on fact. Of all the Africans carried to North America from the 16th through the 18th century, males outnumbered females by a ratio approaching 2 or 1, and they were overwhelmingly adults. The reverse Middle Passage, quote unquote, from the America to Spain was Just the opposite. The slave traffic consists mostly of children, which a good contingent of women, and a mere sprinkling of men. The main reason was that indigenous peoples going to Europe were intended for work in homes, not on plantations. The European heads of household largely regarded children and women as better suited than men for domestic service. Children were more acceptable than adults, learned new languages quickly, and they could be trained and modeled with greater ease. Women were less threatening than men, and could be sexually exploited. These preferences had enduring demographic consequences. Most slaves held in Italian and Spanish households in the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries, rather slaves, Tartars, Greeks, Russians, or Africans were women. Females comprised of astonishing 80% or more of the slaves living in Genoa and Venice, the two leading slave-owning cities in Italy. The situation was similar in the Iberian Peninsula. Contrary to what one might expect, women accounted for the majority of African slaves in the cities such as Granada and Lisbon. Thus, it is no wonder that Europeans would also demand women and children from the New World. Slave prices in the Caribbean already implied such preferences. Women were easily the most expensive of all indigenous slaves. On average, an adult native woman in Santo Domingo or Havana cost 60% more than adult males. Girls were next, followed by boys in the middle of the price range. Then full-grown men, who were considerably cheaper. It is difficult to know exactly what determined these prices. One possibility is that the supply of women and minors was less abundant due to the restrictions on their capture and enslavement. But the most likely explanation is simply that the demand for women and children was much greater. Indeed, scattered price information indicates that the premium of indigenous women and children spanned the entire hemisphere, from southern Chile to northern Mexico, and endured from the 16th through the 19th century. Indigenous women and children were carried to Europe primarily because customers wanted them. Additionally, the well-intentioned but ultimately deleterious royal policies regarding indigenous slavery played a role. As we have seen, the Spanish crown originally prohibited indigenous slavery, except in the handful of cases: cannibalism, ransomed indigenous peoples, and slaves obtained in just wars. But closed those loopholes in 1542 with the passage of the new laws. As a result, Spaniards who wished to transport indigenous peoples to Europe had to demonstrate that they were taking legitimate slaves, branded and bearing the appropriate documentation from the time when slavery was legal, and where accompanied by willing native travelers. Faced with these circumstances, traffickers went to great lengths to procure willing indigenous peoples, particularly children, who were more easily tricked and manipulated than adults. Years later, when these indigenous peoples appeared in court and recounted their lives, they often began with how they had been taken to Spain by deception and trickery when they were 12 or 13 years old. Some enslaved children may have been even younger. Since native children did not come with birth certificates, traffickers determined age by height, by the presence of public hair, and undoubtedly by the need to comply with regulations that prohibited the enslavement of children below age 12. Once these indigenous peoples were in Spain, their lives revolved around the master's house. Occasionally, they accompanied their masters on errands, who were sent out of the house to fetch water, food, or some other necessity. For the most part, however, they were confined to the home, where their chores were never ending. They swept floors, prepared food, looked after children, and worked in the master's trade. On duty at all hours of the day and night, they watched as the days turned into months and years. The major milestone of their lives occurred when they were transferred from one master to the next. In turn for their caseless work, they received no compensation except room and board. The case of a slave named Gaspar illuminates this situation. Gaspar was 13 when the Spanish merchant found him in Hispaniola, and by means of trickery took him to Cervelli. For the next 21 years, he served in various households around the Spanish port. In 1559, when he was in his early 30s, he finally ran away. He drifted in a city, eking out and living for more than a month, until quite by chance his master spotted him in the Plaza de San Francisco. Rather than risking public scandal or a violent altercation, the master prudently called a police officer, who in turn approached Gaspar. Instead of returning the slave to his master, however, the guard took him to the municipal jail, where the local authorities launched an investigation. As a child, immediately after disembarking in Cervelli, Gaspar has been sold for 36 ducats to the family of tailors and weavers. The bill of sale describes him as a 13-year-old, quote, obtained in a just war, end quote, who was, quote, not a drunkard or a thief or an escapist, end quote, and who had, quote, no public or private illness. All stock phrases that appeared in contracts involving slaves of all races and ethnicities. In his new home, he joined two indigenous women who were already working there. The three native people spent their days under the watchful eye of Ana Sanchez, the matriarch of the family. In addition to doing chores around the house, Gaspar was given some weaving to do, which enabled him to become skilled in this trade. After 13 years of service, Gaspar was transferred to a new household. The occasion was the marriage of one of Ana Sanchez's daughters. Gaspar was part of the dowry. Giving slaves as a dowry was a common practice in early modern Spain, and a clever way of parents to shield their newlywed daughter from the increased workload of setting up a household, tending to a husband, and starting a family. For Gaspar, this move was only the first in the series of transfers. Over the next few years, Ana Sanchez's intentions was to give each of her children a turn with him. After staying with her daughter for some time, Gaspar was transferred to a household of Luis Alvarez, a matriarch's son. From the surviving documentation, it is not possible to determine how long Gaspar remained with the daughter. When he came to Luis Alvarez, or why he also spent time in other households working as a weaver. Years later, Gaspar declared in court that all along the person who had remained truly in control of his life was Ana Sanchez. Complicating all of these moves was Gaspar's wife. Ana Sanchez had consented to his marriage to Elvira, a free indigenous woman working in her household as a weaver. Gaspar and Alvera probably occupied a room in the house and were able to stay together even when Gaspar was temporarily rented out to other weavers. But in 1559, Aniceto sold Gaspar to a 60-year-old man named Bartholomew Vayo. The new owner refused to accommodate the indigenous couple. He took Gaspar away from Cervelli and kept him as his personal servant during the lengthy stay in the Spanish court. A few days after Gaspar and his master returned to Cervelli, the slave fled from the elderly Vajo. Gaspar's story reveals that slaves could improve their conditions with the passage of time. He started out as an indigenous boy from Espanola who had been deceived and victimized by a slave trader. Once in Spain, he acquired a trade, became an assistant to his master, got married, and expected to be treated with the consideration due to a loyal and valuable servant. And yet, as Gaspar discovered, slaves could lose their hard-earned social esteem in an instant. After being sold to Bartholomew Vajo, working for him for some time, Gaspar decided to risk everything by becoming a fugitive of the law. The basic justification of slavery invoked by theologians and officials was that indigenous people like Gaspar were better off in Christian homes than in their own state of naturalizia, or nature, or a term that conjured up images of barbarity and heathenism. What a bunch of ass. Even as the exploited underclass, the argument went, slaves had the opportunity to save their souls and acquire the rudiments of civilization. Indigenous peoples did become Europeanized during their long years of bondage in the old world. But this acquisition of Western culture came at a tremendous cost. Gaspar's story leaves no doubt that even the most well-intentioned masters participated in a system of producing degradation, exploitation, and bitter resentment. The story of Maria, an indigenous woman from Mexico City, reveals that women faced a different set of circumstances. Maria had a relationship with a Spanish merchant of clothes and jewels named Juan Marquez. Although we have few details about their life together in Mexico City, it is certain that they were not married. Years later, Maria's brother, Pedro, testifies simply that Marquez had a carnal relationship with my sister, and from this relationship, they had 3 children, 2 girls and 1 boy. Regardless of the precise nature of the relationship, Juan Marquez regarded Maria as his partner and recognized their 3 mestizo children, Catalina, Luisa, and Juan, as his own. They lived in Mexico for some years before moving to Spain, where they settled in Caded, Raggio, a small town in New Castile, with an imposing castle, a cathedral, and a massive outer wall. Maria's brother Pedro, by all accounts, a very resourceful man, came along as well. In one sense, Maria Marquez defied the social inventions of small Spanish towns by establishing a household with 5 Mexican indigenous peoples. But in another respect, these natives fit into the pre-existing social grid. Maria was perceived as Juan Marquez concubine, and the children as criados, children who were not members of the family but were raised in the household and given room and board in exchange for doing menial jobs. Pedro's status must have been the most difficult to pin down. The people of Caudade, Rodrigo, or familiar with African and indigenous slaves, who could usually be identified by the brands of their faces. Yet Pedro had no visible brand, and when curious neighbors would ask if the indigenous man was a slave, Juan Marquez would reply emphatically that Pedro, quote, was not his slave or anyone else's, but a free man, end quote. Most Spaniards familiar with the Marquez household knew that Pedro and Maria were not, quote, wild or nomadic indigenous people caught in raids and sold in slave markets in the Caribbean, but rather, quote, city indigenous peoples who had always been free. The indigenous people situation in Caudade, Rodrigo, deteriorated steadily. First, Juan Marquez decided to take a Spanish wife. Marriage to a European was more appropriate for the successful merchant. He married an assertive woman named Isabel del Herrera. Her arrival to Marquez household reduced Maria's status to that of a concubine / servant and drastically reconfigured the lines of authority. When Isabel del Herrera was later asked in court if, quote, during the time she had lived and spoken with Juan Marquez, her husband, she had never heard that Maria and children were free, end quote. She said no. From her testimony, one can also gather that there was no love lost between Isabel and Maria. Relationship between wives and living in concubines were normally contentious throughout the Mediterranean world, and this was no exception. Although Isabella del Herrera was keen on asserting her authority over the indigenous peoples in her household, Juan Marquez continued to treat the children well and to protect their mother. When Maria died, sometime in the early 1540s, it was up to Pedro to defend his freedom and that of his nieces and nephew. The final demotion of Pedro and the children occurred when Juan Marquez fell ill during a business trip. In those throes of death, the merchant wrote his last will and testament, leaving everything to Isabella del Herrera. Marquez died a few days later, and his wife embarked on the long contemplated reorganization of the household. She immediately sold Pedro for 10,000 maravedis and put the children up for sale, not concerned if that meant splitting them up among separate households. Pedro fought back. Suddenly threatened as a slave, he sought out an attorney and sued Isabel del Herrera to recover his freedom, stop the sale of the children, and keep the family together. Pedro's lawsuit was successful. He recovered his freedom and obtained custody of children. The journey of Pedro and his family from free indigenous peoples to slaves and back to free exemplifies both the uncertain status of indigenous peoples in the mid-16th centuries and the legal options available to them. Fight for their freedom. Doing good. For indigenous men and women who seldom stepped outside the house, the thought of initiating legal proceedings and making formal statements in front of lawyers, judges, and owners must have been daunting. Yet the demands of public appearance paled in comparison with their private ordeals. The minute the lawsuit was filed, the relationship with their masters turned decidedly hostile. Since the slaves had nowhere else to go, they generally continued to live under the same roof with their masters during their trials, which could last for months or even years, giving masters ample opportunities to punish, torture, or somehow make their slaves deists. detest. So routinely did the masters beat their petitioning slaves or hidden them away in rural properties beyond the arm of the law, that the legal document informing them that they had been sued included the clause warning them against such retaliation. Thus, indigenous slaves had the chance to become free, but only at the risk of anguish and bodily harm. They also faced the real possibility of losing in court. And in that case, their efforts and suffering would have earned them nothing but their master's internal hatred. The multi-generational saga of Beatriz and her children is a good example of the workings of the Spanish legal system, as yet as an incredible tenacity of both masters and slaves, described as, quote, a short, thin woman with a missing upper tooth, end quote. Beatriz arrived in Spain when she was 14, but already carried a baby named Simon. Both were given to an up-and-coming resident of the town of Camarona, named Juan Casino, a part of his wife's dowry in 1534, and remained in his household for 24 years. During this time, the relationship between master and slaves evolved and become quite contentious. First, Casino sold off Simmons against Beatriz will after he discovered that the little boy had stolen from him. Casino then mistreated Beatriz, who bore 4 more children by unidentified men. All 4 remained in Casino's house as slaves. A turning point in the relationship occurred around 1559 when Beatriz's oldest daughter, Catalina, a feisty 17-year-old, repeatedly tried to escape, urging the others to do the same. Juan Casino, who had become a wealthy merchant and alderman of the town of Comona, could not tolerate this challenge. He sent Catalina to a nearby barber, quote, next time to the meat shop, end quote, who branded her on the face with a hot iron. During the trial, Casino declared that Catalina had become incorrigible, quote, always trying to escape and having stolen a money purse, a silver chain, jewels, cheese, wool, wine, and whatever else she and her mother could get. Shortly after the branding of Catalina, Beatriz and her daughter began to speak out about being indigenous peoples and having the right to be free. They had heard that some indigenous peoples living in the neighboring city of Cervelli, who had successfully sued for their freedom. In the spring of 1558, after 24 years of service, Beatriz fled Casino's house. Leaving her children behind, she made her way to Cervelli, where she remained for 5 months, meeting with lawyers and officials. With the help of the Procuraduría General de Indigenos Francisco Sacramento, Beatriz gathered witnesses and prepared her case. When everything was ready at the end of September, Juan Casio was summoned to Cervelli to answer the charges lodged against him by his slave Beatriz. The case could not have been more straightforward. If Beatriz could prove that she had come from the Spanish Indies, meaning all the Spain's overseas colonies, including Mexico, Casino would have to set her free according to the provisions of the new laws. For the same reason, Beatriz's children would also go free. The judges were at first sympathetic when Beatrice claimed she was from Mexico. Then they even noted that the plaintiff had, quote, every appearance of someone from the Indies, end quote. But when they asked Beatrice if she could speak the Mexican language, Nahuatl, she said that she could not. Beatrice and Segamento presented their witnesses, all of whom lived in the immediate neighboring of Juan Casino's household. A window from just up the street, the butcher's wife, a shoemaker named Diego Gomez. They all affirmed that Beatrice spoke, quote, a strange tongue, end quote, and declared that she was an indigenous person from Mexico. Beatrice's star witnesses was a blind indigenous person named Juan Vasquez, who claimed to have known Beatrice from 13 years. His testimony, almost poetic, has come down to us, recording in the third person, quote, even though this witness could not see and the said Beatrice, he knew it was her because the words they have exchanged, and the witness believed that she was a native from Malacata, because she is from New Spain and understands the tongue of Malacata, and it is the same that Beatrice speaks, and he has never heard anything contrary to this. Indigenous people taken to Spain when they were very young often could not speak native languages or remember much about their homelands. Some slave owners' most common strategy consisted of asserting that their slaves had not come from Spanish Indies, but from the Portuguese Indies, Portuguese colonies, Brazil, northern and western Africa, and parts of Asia, where the enslavement of natives was legal. Juan Casio took precisely this tact. He declared that, quote, he had always believed Batiz to be an Arab person from northern and western Africa, because she often said that she was the daughter of a Moor. Casino cunning lawyers went on to subject Beatrice to a battery of leading questions. What types of fabric exist in her homeland? Had she seen camels, elephants, tigers, or lions? Were there spices such as ginger, pepper, cinnamon, or cloves? His obvious intention was to exploit Beatrice's gullibility and lack of knowledge. Casino lawyers also seized on the assertion that Beatrice was from Malacate. He demonstrated that no such place exists in the Americas, but posited that in all likelihood, the witness was referring to the Malagasy coast of Africa, where the famous Malagatia pepper came from. Casino's lawyers called several witnesses, including the mariner of Lisbon, Louis Calafort, who, after swearing in front of a crucifix, stated that he had sailed many times the coast of Africa and was entirely certain that the Malagati was a stretch of the coast below Sao Tome in the Portuguese Indies. Meanwhile, Beatriz and Juan Vasquez insisted that she came from Malacate in New Spain, Mexico, while other witnesses pointed to other places. A woman called Catalina Hernandez, who claimed to be Beatriz's cousin, testified that, quote, from her father's side, Beatriz was from Matagrata, which she maintained was close to Lima, Peru. And from her mother's side, she was from Puerto Rico, such that from both sides she comes from was Majesty's Indies, end quote. Sarmiento called a witness named Francisco de Vega, who had traveled widely in the New World and had encouraged many slaves from the Portuguese Indies. He continuously expressed the opinion that Beatriz, quote, struck him as someone from the Spanish Indies, end quote. With this divergent and lukewarm testimonies, it was possible for Beatriz to win her case. It was impossible. Okay. We can only imagine that the consequences for her were when she was returned to Cassino. But the fight was not over. 13 years after the first trial, in 1572, Beatriz's oldest daughter, Catalina, sued Cassino again. But when Beatriz had died a slave, Catalina was in her early 30s and had a 20-year-old daughter of her own. And Juan Casillo was an elderly patriarch, a slave owner. His son, Fernando Casillo, was taken over to alderman of Camarano. Although through all the years Catalina's feistiness had remained intact, during the spring of 1572 she spoke with lawyers and officials, including Francisco Sacramento, who was still provocador general de Indigeno. Catalina told them that her mother had been, quote, a woman with little understanding who got drunk on most days. In other words, who was too addled to prepare a good case. This time, Catalina left nothing to chance. She assembled a long list of witnesses and made sure that their testimonies were consistent. They all declared that Beatriz had come from Mexico, and therefore her children and grandchildren had to be free immediately. On this occasion, Cassino's strategy consisted of questioning Catalina's witness credibility. The witness included Africans, indigenous peoples, and some impoverished residents of Camarona, but no Spaniards from old Christians families. Purity of blood was a major concern at this time. Old Christians referred to Spaniards whom had not intermarried with Muslims or indigenous peoples. Real quick, I'm gonna look ahead. Well, not yet. One of these witnesses was a former slave named Isabel Navarra, who was immediately discounted by Cassino side as, quote, a person belonging to the lower race with no fixed opinions and who is untrustworthy because she was who descends from Moors, end quote. Another witness was an indigenous and former slave from Mexico named Morena, who was immediately dismissed by the slave-owning side. She was an indigenous person and, as such, would lie in order to favor Catalina. And as an indigenous person, she was a lowly person with no fixed opinions to whom one should not give credit. When Fernando Casillo learned that these two were going to testify on Catalina's behalf, he, quote, confronted and insulted them, end quote, and used threats to dissuade them from testifying. Both sides were tenaciously, but more than 40 years after Bazin's arrival in Spain, the witnesses' memories were fading, and the information about Beatriz's origins had been mostly lost. The judges found that Francisco Sacramento, on behalf of the said indigenous peoples, had not proved his demands and intentions. The final verdict reads, quote, we therefore must absolve Juan Cassino Agornanis, admonish him to treat his slaves well. Under this ruling, Catalina, her brothers and sisters, and her 10-year-old daughters would remain slaves. Within 2 years, however, the Council of the Indies overturned the ruling of the Set Catalina and her family free. Notwithstanding the illegal experiences of Beatriz and Catalina, the evidence indicates that the majority of indigenous litigants won their cases. The archives in Cervelli contain several documents that attest to these legal victories. Quote, royal order addressed to the justice of these kingdoms of the Indies granted freedom to the indigenous Magdalena, who had been a slave in España Vincent from the town of Medina del Campo, ordered against Juan de Gen, priest of Frangandel, about setting the indigenous people that he had as slaves free, and ordered the Catalina del Olvera, resident of Santi Aldalio, about granting freedom to the indigenous Innis, who she as a slave. Among many others, contextual information contained in some of these judicial proceedings similarly strengthens this conclusion. For example, when Beatriz sued Juan Cancillo in the fall of 1558, one of the judges asked her pointedly, quote, why she had not attained her freedom at the same time that other indigenous people of Cervelli had clearly implied that most other indigenous people had already been freed. The greatest legal victory was probably achieved by two indigenous who sued none other than Nino de Guzman, one of the most influential and ruthless conquistadors in all of Mexico. In the late 1520s and early 1530s, Guzman's power rivaled that of even Hernan Cortez. He served as governor of the province of Panuco and Nueva Galicia, and presided over the first Asturias of Mexico. Yet in 1549, two slaves he had brought back to Spain, Pedro and Luisa, had the audacity to sue him. That's what is more, Pedro and Lucia also demanded 3,000 maravedíes for every year each of them had served since their arrival in Spain in 1539. For someone like Guzman, under who watched 10,000 indigenous peoples from Panku and Nueva Galicia had been sold into slavery, and the loss of the legal battle with those two lowly slaves whom he had raised in his home must have been infuriating. But there was little he could do. Through his lawyer, Guzman sought to reduce the cash reward, arguing that the service provided by the said Pedro and Luisa and of any other indigenous people amounts to very little, as they are useful only in a minor task and little substance, and the work that they performed is not even sufficient to pay for the food and dress, the shoes that they said Guzman was giving them. The new laws did not end indigenous slavery in Spain, but they did initiate the gradual eradication of this peculiar institution in the Iberian Peninsula. After 1542, it became public knowledge that the King of Spain had freed the indigenous of the Americas. Word about indigenous suing their masters and scoring legal victories spread quickly. By the 1550s, indigenous slaves lived in small Spanish towns were well aware that they were entitled to their freedom. Among Spanish owners, the possession of indigenous slaves increasingly became an embarrassment and a brazen violation of the law. More tangibly, owners faced greater difficulties in selling their indigenous peoples at full price. Indigenous slaves continued to exchange to exchange in Spain during the second half of the 16th century and even into the early decades of the 17th century, but a number of transactions declined steadily until they disappeared almost completely. Hold on a second. Let me see here. People remember 58, page 58. Remember page 58. It's going to look ahead. Got 10 minutes. 58, 58, 58, 58. Okay, cool. I think I can make it to there. All right, page 58. All right. The slaves of early Mexico. The Spanish crown also attempted to end indigenous slavery in the New World, but the situation could not have been more different there. Indigenous slaves constituted a major pillar of the society of economies of the Americas. In Mexico, their importance was evident from the very beginning. No sooner had Hernandez Cortez landed on the Gulf of Mexico coast near the site of modern Veracruz in 1519, then he began to anticipate that the land that he was about to enter would include, quote, many heathen indigenous peoples who would wage war on the Spaniards, end quote. Cortez requested permissions from the crown to subdue such groups by force and distribute the vanquished natives as slaves, quote, as it is customary to do in the lands of the infidels, and it is a very just thing to do, end quote. Cortez's breathtaking ascent to the valley of Mexico, eventual conquest of the Aztec Empire, put millions of indigenous people nominally under the control of a few thousand Spaniards. Enslaving all of these natives would have been both impossible and impractical. Instead, Cortez and his men imported the economy system from the Caribbean. Quote, the Spaniards went for the conquest to conquest, subjecting the land, explains one Ferrer. Quote, and after each town was taken, the Spaniards would ask Cortez to grant it to him, and he then received it as a encomienda. In the Caribbean, the encomienda was failed to protect the natives' formal colonialists bent on extracting gold. The encomienda of the central Mexico was less insidious. The indigenous peoples were agriculturalists who had long been accustomed to paying tributes. They continued to transfer the portions of their crops and their products to the Spanish encomenderos, and return the natives' remains in their towns and villages to return a great deal of autonomy. Although abuse was rife, the encomienda of the central Mexico was not tantamount to slavery, but Spanish conquerors also acquired slaves, tens of thousands of them. Many were taken from among those who resisted conquest. They were called, esclavos del guerrillo, or war slaves. According to one of Cortez's soldiers, who later wrote the eyewitness account, before entering the indigenous town, Spaniards requested its inhabitants to submit peacefully, and if they did not come to peace but wished to give us war, we would make them slaves, and we would carry with us an iron brand like this one to mark their face. The crown authorized Cortez and his soldiers to keep these indigenous peoples as long as the conquerors paid the corresponding taxes. Treasury accounts thus offered a few clues about the scope of slaves taken in early Mexico. For the period between January 1521 to May 1522, that is a few months before and after the fall of Chatacalan. Spaniards paid taxes on around 8,000 slaves taken just in the Aztec capital and its immediate surroundings. Thousands more flowed from the Aztecas, the Oaxaca, and the Mohicans, the Tatapecs, and as far away as Guatemala, and these indigenous kingdoms were brought into the Spanish fold. Quote, so great was the haste to make slaves in different parts, end quote. The committed Pharaoh Taraboa de Boventi, also known as slaves, also known as Motolana, some years later, quote, they were brought into Mexico City in great flocks like sheep, so they could be branded easily, end quote. Besides the slaves taken in military campaigns, Spaniards also purchased indigenous peoples who had already been enslaved by other indigenous peoples and were regularly offered in markets and streets. They were called esclavos de rescate, or ransom slaves. To distinguish these slaves from those taken in war, the Spaniards used a different type of brand, also applied on their face. And here's the brand. Let's show the brand. That's the brand on their face. And I think there's another one. That's the other brand. All right. Slavery had been practiced in Mexico since the time immemorial. Pre-contact indigenous peoples had sold their children or even themselves into slavery because they had no food. Many indigenous people had sold into slavery by other indigenous people as punishment for robbery, rape, and other crimes. So they're about crimes. Okay, so these people were already doing, some wars, slaves were set aside for public sacrifice or ritual cannibalism. Some towns even had holding pens where men and women were fattened before the festivities. All of these pre-contact forms of bondage operated in specific cultural contexts. But as Brett Rushforth has recently argued, they were closed enough to what Europeans understood as slavery that they persisted into the post-contact period. This was certainly the case in central Mexico, where Spaniards acquired indigenous peoples in open-air markets, or decades after conquest. In the 1520s, these slaves were so plentiful that their average price was only 2 pesos, far less than the price of the horse or cow. Spaniards typically traded small items such as a knife or a piece of cloth to exchange for these human beings. As for their number, we do not have the slightest indication, as these transactions were private and went untaxed. 16th century Spaniards gave widely different estimates of the overall numbers of indigenous slaves. La Casa recorded that by the middle of the century, more than 33 million slaves have been made in Mexico, Central America, and Venezuela. The Franciscan Friar Tarbuo de Baventi, who considered Las Casas a turbulent, injurious, and prejudicial man, estimated that the number of slaves taken in the different province of Mexico up to 1555 to be less than 200,000 and possibly not even 100,000. It is clear that even at the low end of this range, indigenous slaves had become the major portions of Mexico's workforce. The urgent need for slaves became evident during Mexico's gold rush in the 1520s. At first, Spanish overlords sent their encomiendas, indigenous indigenous peoples to the mines, but the natives resisted this breach of the original economies terms. Moreover, after the Caribbean experience, the Crown expressively forbade the use of economies indigenous peoples for mining. Therefore, mine owners had to resort to indigenous and African slaves organized in work gangs known as quadrillas. Notarial documents gives us fleeting glimpse of this ruthless exploitative world. Fernando Alonso, an ironsmith from Mexico City, and a rancher named Nicolas Lopez del Placatos Rubio formed a partnership to develop a mine in Manchocan. The ironsmith was to contribute crowbars and assorted tools to the operations, along with 100 indigenous slaves. Quote, up to 200 if possible, end quote. While the ranchers agreed to feed these workers for the years, workers like these became an integral part of the mines where they toiled. They settled down around the mines and performed specialized tasks. In fact, much of the value of the mines were derived from the labor attached to it. As natural documents shows, all sales of mines included the mines of slaves. For instance, Pedro Gonzalo Najera sold his stake in the mine of Ocacta in the summer of 1528, and was able to get 600 pesos for it, largely because it had, quote, 100 slaves taken in a good war and skilled in the work of the mines. Interesting, these laborers were both males and females. In 1525, contracts between Pedro de Villalobos and Alvaro Melendez stipulated that each partner would supply 50 indigenous slaves between men and women. The sales of one mine involved 60 indigenous slaves, half males, half females. And another included a clause that allowed the new owners of the mine to select, quote, 50 indigenous slaves, 30 males and 20 females, and all aged 30 years or younger. All along with the indigenous peoples were a handful of African slaves who performed specialized tasks. Immediately after conquest, indigenous slaves were abundant and cheap, while African slaves were rare and expensive. Thus, the quadrilla of Pedro del Simplicidad and Martin Sanchez in 1528 consisted of 20 indigenous slaves along with 4 Africans who operated a blacksmith shop to make crowbars. Tellingly, one of the provisions of their contract was that should the 4 black slaves die or run away, both partners would absorb the losses. As the centuries progressed, the share of African slaves in the quadrillas increased, but indigenous continued to make up the majority of slaves. As in many other things, the ubiquitous Cortez led the way in mining. After toppling the Aztec Empire, he turned this formidable energy and resources to this enterprise. As is evident from the notarial documents, mining was not just a matter of digging holes in the ground. It also required a large number of workers, all of whom needed to be fed, clothed, and supplied with tools. Cortez was in the best position to invest in mining because he owned the largest commandantes on all of Mexico. On November 20th, 1536, the celebrated Spanish leader acquired 1/4 of the mine called Manaraca del Alborada in Saltepec, along with 20 indigenous slaves of both sexes. Later in the day, he paid 10,000 pesos for another fourth of Manaraca del la Alborada, which also came with, quote, a certain number of indigenous slaves and their tools, end quote. And before the day was over, he dispersed 6,230 pesos to acquire yet another nearby mine, which came with 70 indigenous slaves, although he spent more than 20,000 pesos and acquired between 100 to 200 indigenous slaves in a single day. Ultimately, not only was Cortez the richest man in Mexico, he was also the largest owner of indigenous slaves, and everywhere Cortez led, others followed. And we're gonna end there. The next will be the new regime. Fuck Cortez. And we're on 64. We ended on 64, page 64. 64, page 64. What's up?
I really enjoyed the reading. I didn't realize that many indigenous people had been enslaved.
Yeah. Yeah, and then like, even though like indigenous, and I like how they did the compare and contrast that indigenous people, even though like a lot of them lost their battles and stuff, and some of them won their battles, he did the compare and contrast that black Africans that are enslaved do not get those kind of treatments. So I love the compare and contrast, but I also like that he went into saying that most of these people sometimes didn't win their cases or won their cases way outright and were beaten and more abused during the stages between the trial and their either becoming either innocent or guilty. Yeah. Yep, another book. Yeah. Another book. So, the new regime. So yeah, fuck on Cortez and all that shit. And like, these people that they're talking about were like, I guess in the indigenous part, they said that they're like criminals that did wrong things against the communities and stuff like that. So, kind of
Some of them.
Yeah. How am I liking the book? It's alright. It's decent. It's really good. It's really good. I like it how they make sure they compare and contrast the difference between indigenous slavery and African slavery. So I like that part. But realizing how much Cortez and other places and fucking Columbus, we're in Cortez now, did these egregious things. And Cortez, one of the biggest owners of indigenous slaves of all of Mexico, and the richest. What a dick. But anyways, does anybody else have anything else to say? And if anybody wants to come up, they're welcome to come up. If not, I'll leave it just for a couple seconds, a couple minutes. Is there anything else you want to say, Joe? Are you good?
I'm good. I'm really enjoying the book. I'm following along, and it's really good.
All right, good. I'm going to make sure it goes back. I'm going to do something here. $64, right? Yep, page 64. Sweet. All right then, well, if no one else has anything else to say, I'll go ahead and close it out. I appreciate everybody for sticking around.